Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I want to thank my colleague from Utah for his comments. I want to thank his continued commitment always to make sure that we, Congress, handles everything we can. We don't defer constantly to the executive branch in making decisions that we should be making. This is a simple example of why we should be making this decision. This is following the science, and I'm actually shocked that my colleague from the state of Washington does not want to follow the science. I don't understand why my colleague from the state of Washington wants government to be dictating things. I mean, why do we want to dictate to Americans how they lead their lives? Why does she think that the government why has government lifted mandates in states all across the country, but not, and why is the CDC fine with every place but public transportation? It just doesn't make any sense. Americans will do the right thing. It's not our job to dictate, to tell them how to lead their lives. If someone wants to wear a mask, so be it. They should do it. But the government has no right to tell them that they have to wear a mask. If an airline or another private company decides it wants to implement a mask policy, have at it. We shouldn't prohibit them from wanting to do that, but we should not be dictating this. So I'm disappointed that my colleague from the state of Washington didn't go along, but I think it's important for us to always make sure we're doing the right thing for the American public. And right now, the right thing is eliminate the mask mandate on public transportation. Thank you, Mr. President.
President.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I rise today in support of two critical nominations. Jen Easterly's nomination to be the Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, commonly referred to as CISA, within the Department of Homeland Security, as well as Robin Carnahan to be the Administrator of the General Services Administration, or GSA. Mr. President, our country is under attack. Nation-state actors and criminal organizations are relentlessly targeting our government, critical infrastructure, and key industries to infiltrate networks, steal information, conduct espionage, and demand ransom payments. These cyber attacks pose a serious threat to our national security. As we saw from the SolarWinds hack, as well as the Colonial Pipeline and GBS ransomware attacks, cyber criminals are constantly looking to exploit cybersecurity vulnerabilities and find the weakest link. We must be vigilant about preventing these attacks, and we need a strong, coordinated approach from across the federal government to better secure America's networks. That means the Senate needs to confirm qualified cybersecurity nominees so that they can get to work immediately. CISA is the lead domestic agency for cybersecurity in the federal government. It's responsible for ensuring that federal departments and agencies, our private sector critical infrastructure partners, and the American people have the resources to detect, to withstand, and to respond to cyber attacks. GSA provides a wide range of support to agencies across the government. One of GSA's key functions is to provide funding and expertise to help agencies both modernize and secure their IT systems and their networks. We need Senate-confirmed leadership at the top of these critical agencies, and Mr. President, we need it today. Ms. Easterly has served for over 3 decades in the federal government and private sector. Since 2017, Ms. Easterly has led Operations Center for Morgan Stanley's cyber defense strategy. She was also a critical member of the Cyber Solarium Commission, which has made 80 recommendations for cyber deterrence, 25 of which already have become law. Prior to joining the private sector, Ms. Easterly served as the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterterrorism, the Deputy for Counterterrorism at the National Security Agency, and was instrumental in the design and creation of the U.S. Cyber Command. On top of all of these incredible accomplishments, Ms. Easterly is a two-time recipient of the Bronze Star and retired from the U.S. Army after more than 20 years of service in intelligence and cyber operations. Ms. Easterly is more than qualified for this position, and this body needs to confirm her nomination today to lead CISA. Every day that this body delays confirming critical leaders like Ms. Easterly and Ms. Carnahan leaves our federal system and our nation vulnerable to cyber attacks. We have already seen the damage and the chaos from these attacks. The Colonial Pipeline attack disrupted the lives of millions of Americans, created fuel shortages, and saddled customers with high gas prices for weeks. The next major breach could be even worse. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting Ms. Easterly's nomination to lead CISA and to take on the vital mission of strengthening our defenses and fighting back against the persistent cyber attacks that threaten our nation each and every day. Cybersecurity and strengthening our federal networks are not partisan issues. Cyber attacks put each and every one of us at risk. And I would hope my colleagues will allow these nominees to be confirmed today so they can keep us safe. And with that, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that, notwithstanding Rule 22, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 176, Jen Easterly of New York to be the Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Department of Homeland Security, and the Senate vote on the nomination without intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
The Senator from Florida.
reserving the right to object, I want to make one thing very clear. I'm here today to ensure accountability to the American people. I voted to support Ms. Easterly's confirmation in committee last week, and if Senator Schumer filed for cloture like he has done for dozens of other nominees, this year I would vote to support her confirmation here on the Senate floor. This isn't about Ms. Easterly. This isn't about cybersecurity. Remember, we just unanimously confirmed the National Cyber Director just last week. I'm here today because families in my state of Florida and across our nation deserve accountability, and President Biden has shown a total lack of accountability when it comes to addressing the border crisis. That's why I announced last month that I would be holding all of President Biden's nominees for the Department of Homeland Security from being approved through our expedited process until he and Vice President Harris visit the border and they see for themselves the crisis that their failed policies of open borders and amnesty have created. I understand the White House just announced that Vice President Harris will be visiting the border later this week. I hope that's true. The administration has made a lot of promises that they haven't kept, like not raising taxes, reopening schools quickly, being tough on Communist China, the list goes on and on. Trust me, I'm glad the Vice President seems to be taking my advice and finally listening to the American people. I truly hope that she gets down to the border to see the crisis firsthand that her administration and their failed policies have created. I hope she meets with the National Border Patrol Council, hear from them what our brave CBP agents are going through every day to keep us safe. I hope she meets with border community sheriffs who are responsible for keeping our families safe. I hope she meets with ICE and CBP section chiefs so she can hear firsthand the impact on them. I hope she takes an aerial tour like I did and sees the gaps in the wall. I hope she sees where the lights and cameras are sitting, powerless, without electricity, and unable to be used to monitor our border. I hope she meets with families who have been the victims of trafficking and hears the horrific stories they have, what they've been through because of this crisis. I hope she visits border communities that have been put in a position to house and care for the historic number of people illegally crossing our border. I hope she talks with families who have tragically lost loved ones from the massive amounts of fentanyl that the cartels are moving across our border. I hope she talks to the ranchers impacted by people illegally crossing their lands. More than anything, I hope this isn't a political stunt. If she truly goes to see this crisis, I'm going to lift all my holds of DHS political nominees. It's that simple. What's happening at the border is a crisis. There is simply no other word for it. It's been 3 months since I traveled to the southern border to see exactly how President Biden's open borders and amnesty policies are wreaking havoc. I took a tour with Governor Ducey. We did an aerial tour. What you see is a wall, and then all of a sudden these openings. They intentionally didn't put up the gates. I remember my colleagues were saying, oh, we don't all need the wall. We can have lights and cameras so that they can monitor from someplace else. They're out there. They're just not hooked up to electricity intentionally. You can't make this stuff up. It's been 3 months since I made clear that President Biden and Vice President Harris need to get to the border and see the crisis that their administration has created. It's been 3 months since they pledged to visit the border. Since then, as you all know, you look at all the numbers, apprehensions at our southern border are at a record high. More than 180,000 illegal aliens tried to cross our southern border last month and were apprehended, the highest in 21 years. This is a crisis. It threatens our national security and the safety of American families. And we don't know how many people we didn't apprehend. President Biden's immigration policies are putting unaccompanied minors at risk of human trafficking, violence, sexual abuse, and separation from their families. They're leading to an alarming increase in human trafficking and drug smuggling by cartels. The FBI Director Wray said this month there is no question that cartel activity from Mexico is spilling over into the United States. We're seeing it here in Florida. I talked to sheriffs. What they're telling me is unbelievable amounts of fentanyl are coming across the border and getting into our state, putting Florida families in danger. I was down in one lab, and they were telling me that 2 people died that week from fentanyl. But instead of securing the border and finishing wall construction projects, President Biden is terminating all the wall projects. Why would you be doing this? The inaction by President Biden and Vice President Harris is inexcusable. I don't know what they're waiting for. Why can't they acknowledge that a secure border is the best thing for our nation? If you talk to people around this country, they want a secure border. Why can't they stand up against the radical left to say that open borders are dangerous to American families? 2 weeks ago, the Vice President went to Guatemala and Mexico. While she was there, she was asked by Lester Holt when she was going to go to the border, and she laughed. This is not a laughing matter. This is a crisis, and people are dying because of this crisis. It should make all of us furious. People are dying, children are being exploited, and they're being abandoned in the desert. Earlier this year, 2 Ecuadorian children, 2 little girls, 3 and 5 years old, were dropped over a 14-foot section of the border wall. We all saw the pictures. They were abandoned there in the middle of the night. 2 innocent little girls, just 3 and 5 years old. Can you imagine how terrified they were? I think of my daughters, I think of my grandchildren. We all do. We all think how would our family deal with that? It just breaks your heart. The Vice President claims the Vice President's trip was down to Guatemala, Mexico, was to talk about the root cause of the immigration. I don't believe that. The Vice President's trip wasn't any more than a poorly executed political stunt. President Biden and Vice President Harris need to stop avoiding the crisis, stop laughing off this threat, get to the border, take real steps. And as I said, once they actually go to the border and actually see the crisis, I'm going to lift my holds. This is all to make sure they go to the border. But as long as they refuse to help those risking their lives every day to keep us safe, as long as they refuse to visit the border and put an end to the humanitarian crisis that they created, I'm going to keep my holds on. Those two little girls and all the people that have been trafficked, they deserve better. The millions of immigrants in our country going through a legal process, they deserve better. Our Border Patrol agents, they deserve better. All American families deserve better. Therefore, I object.
The objection is heard. The Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I'd like to discuss Ms. Carnahan's qualifications further before asking for consent on her confirmation. Ms. Carnahan has an extensive career spanning federal and state government, as well as the private sector. During the Obama administration, she founded and led the state and local practice at 18F, a technology consulting firm consultancy within GSA. In this role, Ms. Carnahan worked with state and local government agencies to improve and modernize their digital services. Prior to her tenure at 18F, Ms. Carnahan served as Missouri's Secretary of State, where she focused on modernizing IT infrastructure to improve service for hundreds of thousands of customers. Ms. Carnahan is a nationally recognized government technology leader, and in 2017 was named one of the federal government's top women in tech. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting Ms. Carnahan's nomination to lead GSA. From modernizing and securing federal networks to strengthening supply chain security, GSA plays a critical role in bolstering our national security. So with that, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that, notwithstanding Rule 22, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of the following nomination, Calendar 175.
Is there objection? Without objection, the clerk will report.
General Services Administration, Robin Carnahan of Missouri to be Administrator.
Mr. President, I ask consent that the Senate vote on the nomination without intervening action or debate, and if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, all without intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to the nomination, that any statements related to the nomination be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
The question is on the nomination. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed.
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, after months of unnecessary hand-wringing, Vice President Harris has finally announced that she intends to visit the U.S.-Mexico border. She was, as you will recall, tapped by the President to lead the efforts to stem the current humanitarian crisis back in March. But 3 months in, she spent more time trying to figure out how to support Central American countries than how to help American law enforcement and community leaders in Texas. In the absence of any action from the administration, in fact, any acknowledgement of the crisis at all, the humanitarian crisis has got nothing but worse. In March, the first month of her heading up the administration's response, there were 173,000 migrants that crossed our southern border. Then in April, the number went up to 178,000, and in May, 180,000 migrants. We're now on track to see the highest number of total yearly border crossings in 2 decades, according to the Secretary of Homeland Security, Mr. Mayorkas. At the center of this crisis are unaccompanied children who are brought to this country by cartels and human smugglers. We know that the migrant children endure a long and dangerous journey to our border, often arriving malnourished, abused, and in critical health. Some of the young girls even arrive pregnant, and we know that many of them have been sexually assaulted en route by these human smugglers who care nothing for their welfare. All they care about is the cold, hard dollar. I've talked to a number of these children and heard them retell their horrific stories about their journey from their home to our border. Since January, since the time that President Biden and Vice President Harris were inaugurated, more than 65,000 unaccompanied children have entered our country with no parent and no adult guardian, an absolutely devastating figure. These children are then placed with sponsors in the interior of the United States, sometimes a family member, sometimes a complete stranger. 30 days after these children are placed with their American-based sponsor, not necessarily even an American citizen, a full 20% of them don't respond to a phone call or a wellness check when a person associated with the U.S. government knocks on the door. and we have no idea what happens to these children once they're lost to the system. The Border Patrol's Rio Grande Valley sector is the epicenter of this human crisis. Between October and April, that's where nearly half of all unaccompanied children were encountered. In the 3 months since the Vice President has been in charge of this crisis, I've visited the Rio Grande Valley sector twice. I've spoken with law enforcement, elected officials, non-governmental organizations that try to be of assistance to the migrants while they're in the country, and a long list of other people who are trying to do everything in their power to manage this overwhelming number of humanity coming across our border. On Friday, President Harris won't get to speak with these men and women. Why is that? Well, she'll be more than 1,000 miles away down the border from the Border Patrol sector experiencing the worst of this crisis. I know there are probably folks who are not from Texas who think that the whole border is exactly the same, but that's not true. I had the chance to travel to Tucson with Senator Sinema, the senator from Arizona, and I got a chance to observe how different the border is in the Tucson sector from the Rio Grande Valley, which she traveled with me to see after we left Tucson. But since October, the Rio Grande Valley sector has encountered nearly 3 times as many unaccompanied children as the El Paso sector, and more than 7 times more family units. The situation along the entirety of the U.S. border is challenging, to be sure, and El Paso has suffered during the crisis too, no doubt. Law enforcement, non-governmental organizations, and community leaders in every border sector are struggling to manage the massive surge of migrants. When asked why she hadn't visited the border yet, the Vice President said she wasn't interested in grand gestures. Yet here she is, planning a trip in a way that reflects, again, she doesn't really fully comprehend the magnitude of the crisis and where it really exists on steroids, which is the Rio Grande Valley. It's not even fair to say that she's a day late and $1 short. She's nearly 100 days late and 1,000 miles short. By ignoring the Rio Grande Valley, the busiest Border Patrol sector along the U.S.-Texas-Mexico border, the Vice President is shifting the focus away from the most serious problems of the crisis that she's failed to solve or even contribute any constructive ideas to. It won't surprise you to know that during my time in the Senate, because my state does have a 1,200-mile common border with Mexico, I've spent a lot of time listening to and learning from folks who live and work along our border. Our border is a beautiful part of our state, rich in a unique culture and a rich sense of community that you can't find in many parts of the country. Through no fault of their own, these border communities are being overwhelmed by the sheer number of migrants crossing the border, and the local leaders are beyond frustration with the failures of the federal government to live up to its obligation to provide security along an international border. The President and Vice President have, I have to acknowledge, verbally encouraged migrants not to come to the United States, but those words mean nothing. They're hollow rhetoric, indeed, when somebody can simply pick up the phone and call a family member in the United States or watch the evening news and see how easy it is to make your way across the border. Not to mention the fact that the human smugglers, the cartels who charge thousands of dollars per head, are whispering in their ear, saying, "We can get you across the border if you just pay us our fee." The reality of the situation is we're nearing a breaking point. And the Vice President and President could see that if they are only willing to join me and others who would be more than happy to host them by visiting the Rio Grande Valley. The administration has wasted valuable time that could have been spent addressing the crisis. This is a crisis in policy. This is not where building an additional physical barrier would stop many of these migrants. Some of that would, and the Border Patrol said it has a part to play. But the truth is, many of these migrants are turning themselves over to law enforcement authorities. They're not running away because they've figured out the gaps in our law better than we have. The administration has wasted valuable time that could have been spent addressing this crisis, and instead it's just gotten worse. Now the question is, what are they going to do about it? If they're looking for ideas, I'm happy to offer a suggestion. There's already a grassroots plan out there that's built from the bottom up by senators and congressmen most familiar with this crisis. Last month, Senator Sinema, the senator from Arizona, and I introduced the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act, a straightforward, common-sense way to address this crisis. We've been proud to work with two House members. The presiding officer knows Congressman Cuellar from Laredo, Texas, along with Tony Gonzalez, who represents one of the biggest congressional districts contiguous to the U.S.-Mexico border, and they are our co-sponsors in the House. So a bipartisan, bicameral bill to address the very crisis that Vice President Harris and President Biden have been trying to avoid learning more about, at least until now. This legislation has support, as I said, of members of both parties and in both chambers, as well as a diverse range of well-respected organizations. The U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the National Border Patrol Council, the National Immigration Forum, and more than a dozen other organizations support this legislation. I'd be more than happy to sit down with the President and Vice President to discuss our bill, which includes the input of leaders who are dealing with the brunt of the crisis along the border. If the administration truly wants to address this crisis, they need to get serious about how to do so, and a photo op simply will not get the job done. The Vice President, I think, would be well served and would be serving the people of this country well if she would visit the Rio Grande Valley and listen to the law enforcement, elected officials, and NGOs and other men and women who are doing their best to try to deal with this crisis without much help from the administration. Mr. President, the administration has wasted too much time already. Now is not the time for another empty gesture. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise this afternoon in support of the nomination of U.S. Magistrate Judge Deborah Boardman to be a United States District Judge for the District of Maryland. Judge Boardman was favorably reported by the Judiciary Committee on June 10th. I had recommended Judge Boardman along with Senator Van Hollen to President Biden, and I strongly support her nomination. Judge Boardman was nominated to fill the future vacancy created when Judge Richard Bennett, appointed by President Bush in 2003, announced his intentions to take senior status upon the confirmation of his successor. President Biden nominated Judge Boardman for this position on March 30th, and the Judiciary Committee held her confirmation hearing on May the 12th. Shortly after the November 2020 presidential election, I worked with Senator Van Hollen to establish a judicial selection committee in Maryland. We used an open application process with public advertisement and communicated closely with the state, local, and specialty bar associations in Maryland. In particular, we sought out highly qualified and diverse applicant pool. Our committee interviewed everyone who submitted an application, which involved several dozen interviews. Senator Van Hollen and I personally interviewed several finalists before making our recommendations to the White House. I strongly agree with President Biden's request that senators consider nominating individuals whose legal experiences have been historically underrepresented on the federal bench, including those who are public defenders, civil rights and legal aid attorneys, and those who represent Americans in every walk of life. Judge Boardman fits that request. Judge Deborah Boardman was born in Silver Spring, raised in Frederick, and lives in Baltimore. She received a BA from Villanova University. After graduating from college, she accepted a Fulbright scholarship to study in Amman, Jordan. She received her JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. After law school, she clerked for a federal judge on the Eastern District of Virginia, known as the Rocket Docket, for the speed of its caseload. Judge Boardman brings tremendous experience to the courtroom as a sitting U.S. Magistrate Judge in Maryland since 2019, which is the same federal judicial district in which she would become a district judge if confirmed by the Senate. She already handles a heavy caseload in our federal court. As a magistrate judge, Judge Boardman presides over civil cases by consent of the parties, resolves civil discovery disputes, conducts settlement conferences, and presides over preliminary criminal proceedings. Additionally, she administers the District of Maryland's Social Security appeals docket. In civil cases before her by consent of the parties, Judge Boardman rules on motions to dismiss, resolves discovery disputes, decides whether a case should proceed to trial, and presides over bench and jury trials. These cases have involved claims of unemployment discrimination in violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act, claims under 42 U.S.C. 1983, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, qualified and sovereign immunity defenses, and state law claims stemming from contract disputes and personal injury. As you can see, Mr. President, she has broad experience in regards to her tenure as a magistrate judge. She has previously served as the first Assistant Federal Public Defender of Maryland. During her 11-year tenure with the Federal Defender's Office, Judge Boardman represented individuals in both the Greenbelt and Baltimore courthouses that were charged with federal crimes. She also has experience in private practice, as she served as a litigation associate at Hogan & Lovell, formerly known as Hogan & Hartson, in Washington, D.C. from 2001 to 2008. During those years, Judge Boardman worked exclusively on civil matters. She has experience both on the civil side and criminal side. She represented a wide range of corporate and individual clients in state and federal courts. Specifically, she counseled insurance companies, universities, healthcare, and pharmaceutical companies, among others, in business and contract dispute. As a fifth-year associate, the firm selected Judge Boardman to serve as the senior pro bono associate in its nationally recognized pro bono department. She managed the firm's largest pro bono cases full-time and appeared in federal and state courts as a lead attorney in several of these pro bono cases. She tried a wrongful eviction action before a D.C. jury. She was lead counsel in a 3-day evidentiary hearing on habeas corpus petitions in the Circuit Court for the City of Norfolk. She argued numerous discovery motions before the U.S. Magistrate Judge in the District Court for the District of Columbia in an unemployment discrimination class action lawsuit. Madam President, the American Bar Association's Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary gave Judge Boardman its highest, unanimous, well-qualified recommendation after evaluating her integrity, professional competence, and judicial temperament. As Judge Boardman said at her confirmation hearing, she's the daughter of the American Revolution on her father's side and a first-generation American Palestinian descent on her mother's side. Her father was born in New York and was drafted to serve in the U.S. Army in the Vietnam War, and then went on to be a successful businessman. Her mother was born in Ramallah, a Palestinian city in the West Bank. She emigrated to the United States in the 1950s with her parents and 8 brothers and sisters when she was just 13 years of age. She spoke no English, and when she began attending public school in suburban Maryland, she then learned, of course, English and went on to be a successful career as a beautician. Judge Boardman has testified that her parents taught her the value of hard work, the importance of education, the value of family, and the need to be generous to those who are less fortunate in life. In my discussions and meeting with Judge Boardman, I have some impressions that stand out from her as a person. She is fully committed to public service through her diverse professional career as a lawyer, law firm partner, public defender, and now U.S. Magistrate Judge. She regards being a sitting judge as the ultimate and highest calling of public service in the legal profession. She wants to inspire the public's confidence in the judiciary and to hear parties' concerns compassionately while upholding her duty to fairly apply the law. Now, as a U.S. Magistrate Judge, Judge Boardman has told me she understands the absolute importance of adjudicating disputes neutrally and fairly. She surely has the temperament for this position. She has told me that she is naturally curious and tries to avoid making assumptions. Judge Boardman shared with me that her internal compass directed her towards service. Judges are first and foremost public servants, but they hold certain powers over individual lives. She understands that. In her view, a district court judgeship is much more than an achievement. It's a serious public responsibility, which requires a judge to put the public first as they uphold the rule of law. Numerous individuals wrote to me on Judge Boardman's behalf, including several sitting judges, law firm associates, and colleagues from her service in the Public Defender's Office. They unanimously praised Judge Boardman's courtroom skills as a litigator, in particular praising her courtroom presence, sharp legal and analytical skills in both written and oral advocacy, and her high level of professionalism, excellent temperament, and unfailing courtesy to all parties. As a person, I've repeatedly been told by those that know her well that Judge Boardman is the best kind of person to be a judge. She is smart, patient, kind, and tough when she needs to be. She's a hard worker, and she sees all sides of an argument and is always fair and professional in her treatment of others. I was delighted to recommend the nomination of Judge Boardman to President Biden along with Senator Van Hollen. Judicial nominees must meet the highest standard of integrity, competency, and temperament. Judge Boardman will safeguard the rights of all Marylanders and all Americans, uphold the Constitution and rule of law, and faithfully follow the judicial oath to do equal right to the poor and to the rich. I am confident that Judge Boardman will serve the people of Maryland very well once she is confirmed. Madam President, I urge my colleagues to vote for the confirmation of Judge Boardman, who is an outstanding judicial nominee for Maryland. She's already a sitting United States Magistrate Judge on the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland, where she has served the district judges. I look forward to her continued public service to Maryland and to the nation. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent to speak as in morning business for such time as I shall consume.
Without objection.
All right, Madam President, last year, the Federal Communications Commission approved an application by Legato Networks to repurpose federal spectrum in a way that will drastically interfere with GPS and satellite communications. This is a big deal. There are so many people who understand this situation. There's a list of companies behind us that grows every day. Almost every company in America that you know of or have heard of, his name is on this list. The decision that was made will threaten GPS and satellite communications reliability for millions of Americans who depend on it. The reliability of GPS and satellite communications is necessary for safety of life, and operations, national security, and economic activity. And I'm going to pause here for a minute to drive home what this actually means for every American, because people don't know this. They don't know how important GPS is. And yet there's not an American I can think of by description who isn't using it every day. So if something happens to it, there's a serious problems. Here are some of the day-to-day activities that would be difficult when experiencing GPS interference from Ligado. A big one. Using your credit card or your debit card when you are making a purchase or using an ATM, our financial systems rely on GPS timing in order to work. Another one, making a phone call. Cell phone networks rely on GPS synchronized cell towers, so calls can be passed seamlessly. If they experience interference, you could be dropped when moving from one tower to another. Another one of the most that people are not aware of and don't expect is energy. Whether that is filling up your tank with gas at the pump or electrical grids to light our homes, we rely on GPS timing to safely operate underground pipelines and our electricity grid. Farmers and ranchers, and that's something a lot of people are not aware of, but they depend on GPS in satellite communications when planting crops, applying fertilizer, and during harvest operation to move large and critical machinery with precision. Working out, a lot of people don't. I don't do as much as I used to do, but a lot of people, they say that 1/5 of the population, 20% of the population of all Americans use fitness tracker or smartwatch, or the majority of use GPS to count steps and when they track the distance. We all know that. We see them out there every day. They're all using it, and they depend on what? They depend on GPS. Taking a flight. I had occasion, I've been involved in aviation for over 70 years now, and had occasion with 3 friends to fly around the world in 1991 using GPS. And at that time, it may be the first, the equipment that I used was a Trimble TNL 2000. Trimble is one of the big GPS companies. I was using one, TNL 2000. At that time, that may have been, we're checking to see the first time that that's been used for private aviation flying all the way around the world. Again, that's GPS, and that was 1991. And the thing that driving around right now, each day, countless Americans rely on Google Maps, Waze, Apple Maps, and any other navigation system to get them from point A to point B. And while no one hopes to ever need a fire truck or ambulance, or the 911 operators, the EMS, GPS, they use GPS on a daily basis. So there's more. Weather forecasting, the movement of goods on our highways, surveying maritime harbors, channels, and everything else. The list goes on and on. Now, how do we know that Ligado will cause interference? The FCC told us when they approved the Ligado order, and I will read that now because I think people need to understand. I guess you'd say we were warned. The FCC said in their document, that was the document they used on their approval order. They said, quote, Ligado shall expeditiously repair or replace as needed any U.S. government GPS devices that experience or are likely to experience harmful interference from Ligado's operations, unquote. That's a quote. That's what they said. That's what FCC said at that time. Over 21 organizations and companies and industries have filed petitions for reconsideration after the order was released, documenting the damage that they'd face from the Ligado interference. This thing right out behind me is now up to 82. It was 78 this morning, and the list goes on and on. You can hardly think of a corporation in America that isn't on this list. And so it's something that is a very serious problem and widespread. There's one way to put the interference into perspective. Because GPS signals travel from satellite in space, by the time those signals get to Earth's surface, they're low power. Because the FCC order allows Ligado to repurpose spectrum to operate a terrestrial-based network, Ligado signals on Earth's surface will be much more powerful than GPS, causing substantial and harmful interference. And while the FCC required Legato to repair damage to federal agencies that result from the interference, congressional action is needed because the FCC's Legato order fell short in two important ways. First, the order did not provide an adequate description of costs to the federal agencies that would result from Legato's interference. We took bipartisan steps to correct this last year in the NDAA. The NDAA is the largest bill of the year. I happen to have been, for several years, the chairman of this thing. And the NDAA is the National Defense Authorization Bill. It does all the things that we do in the military. And so that's the bill that we're talking about. So we included in that bill a provision directing the Department of Defense to produce an estimate of damages and costs associated with the harmful interference to GPS. We also directed DOD, Department of Defense, and the National Academies of Science to conduct an independent technical review of the harmful interference that Legato could cause. Secondly, the FCC failed to require that Legato bear the cost of interference to state government or pay for interference to devices owned by individual users. Now, we're talking about all Americans out there now, not just government, not state government, not federal government, but everyone else. These are individual users. And I talked already about how many ways we rely on GPS in everyday life. None of that would be protected from interference under the existing Legato order. And that's why I'm introducing legislation. It's a long name, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's called the Recognizing and Ensuring Taxpayer Access to Infrastructure Necessary for GPS and Satellite Communications Act of 2021. Got that? All right. Well, I call it the Retain Act. It's a little more accurate and easy to understand. Now, my legislation ensures federal agencies, state governments, and all other negatively impacted by the actions of a private actor are not left holding the bag when it comes to costs, the amount of money that it would cost to rectify it. And worse, aren't put in a position where they have to push the costs onto the American consumers. Now, why is this legislation necessary? The reliable GPS and satellite communication is important to everyone in the world and drives much of the nation's economy. Now, that's why I'm saying I'm going to ask my colleagues to embrace, endorse, and co-sponsor this legislation. I mean, otherwise, others may be forced to pay for damage that is done by the system. So anyway, we're going to ask our colleagues to join me in co-sponsoring this legislation. If we don't do this and something happens, then it will be paid for by not those responsible parties, but by the taxpayers. And with that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from New York.
As if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
Oh, I ask unanimous consent for a vitiation of the quorum call.
Without objection.
As if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the Majority Leader, in consultation with the Republican Leader, the Senate Armed Services Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 1520, and the Senate proceed to its consideration, that there be 2 hours for debate equally divided in the usual form, and that upon the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate vote on a bill with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object,
Senator from Oklahoma.
and I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President,
Senator from New York.
I rise for the 14th time to call for every senator to have the opportunity to consider and cast their vote on the Military Justice Improvement and Increasing Prevention Act, which would ensure that service members who have been subjected to sexual assault and other serious crimes get the justice they deserve. For nearly a decade, the DoD has argued that removing convening authority from command, as our bill does, would undermine military readiness and good order and discipline. But yesterday, our Secretary of Defense, Secretary Lloyd Austin, endorsed the Independent Review Commission's recommendation that sexual assault and related crimes be moved from the chain of command to trained military prosecutors. It is historic. It's historic that we have, for the first time ever, a Secretary of Defense agreeing that good order and discipline does not rest on a commander deciding whether a case goes forward or not. But we have to remember that the limited changes he's endorsed come from a panel that was only asked to look at one type of crime. They were specifically asked to look at ways to solve the problem of military sexual assault and harassment. They drilled down on those issues of sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence, and child abuse, and they agreed that all of those crimes must be taken out of the chain of command and put in the hands of specialized, highly trained military prosecutors. They see no conflict with making those changes and retaining command control. I remind my colleagues, the mission we are tasked with is larger than the mission that the IRC was tasked with. Our job is to provide our service members with a military justice system that is worthy of the sacrifices they make for our country every day. That's why our bill addresses the fundamental flaw in the military justice system that puts the fate of our service members in the hands of commanders who often know both the accuser and the accused and are not trained lawyers. Our reform draws a bright line and moves all serious crimes, which can lead to serious consequences, to independent military prosecutors. Secretary Austin's endorsement of the IRC's reforms makes it clear that he understands what we understand. Convening authority is not necessary for maintaining command control or for maintaining good order and discipline. Right now, 97% of commanders maintain good order and discipline without having convening authority for general court-martial. Only 3%, level 06 and above, have that unique authority. Our allies have drawn the similar bright line. They've decided that in their military, serious crimes should be taken out of the chain of command and given to trained prosecutors. They have told us through letters and testimony that they saw no diminution in command control or good order and discipline. Good order and discipline rests not on the commander's ability to act as a judge and jury, but on their ability to do their job of instilling a culture of respect between service members and instilling a command climate where these types of actions aren't tolerated. There's no reason to continue to subject service members to a system where commanders, rather than trained military prosecutors, are deciding which cases go to trial. We must move decisions about whether to move forward on cases dealing with serious crimes to the most qualified, most highly trained person. That would be trained military prosecutors. That's all that our bill does. That is what the Military Justice Improvement and Increasing Prevention Act does. In addition, to having a filibuster-proof support in the Senate, this is now a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation. This morning, I stood with Congresswoman Congresswoman Speer, Speaker Pelosi, Congressman Turner, and a bipartisan group of members in the House as they introduced this version of the legislation. The bipartisan support we have in the House includes Republicans with years of military service, former JAGs, former commanders. We had a general from the Republican Party stand up and support that bill this morning. So not only do they understand the importance of having a military justice system that is impartial and highly trained, but also the importance of command and what their role is. So we have a great deal of bipartisan support. This type of bipartisan, bicameral support is rare. It speaks to the importance of this reform, the importance of us meeting our obligation to provide oversight of our military, and the importance of serving those who serve our country in uniform. This morning, we were also joined by the sisters of Vanessa Guillen. Her youngest sister, Lupe, talked about what happened to Vanessa. And she said, quote, "The system that we have now failed my sister, and it's up to us to change it." To change the system that failed Vanessa, moving just sex crimes out of the chain of command would not be enough. She was murdered. We must move all serious crimes, including murder, to independent, impartial military prosecutors. This morning, Lupe said, "Someone will always have to suffer for someone to care. But that stops now. That stops with us." It's time for us to do the job right, to prove Lupe right. Our service members, as Secretary Austin did, deserves nothing, as Secretary Austin said, deserves nothing less. Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
President.
Senate is in a quorum call.
Then, therefore, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Earlier this week, in fact, yesterday, the Senate Democrats attempted an unprecedented power grab in the Senate that, in my view, clearly would have affected the sanctity of our elections and violated our Constitution. SR 1 was one of the most monstrous bills I've seen during my time in Congress, and it certainly didn't meet my standard of doing things that are constitutional. In doing so yesterday, the Senate Democrats underscored for me something I thought I knew well, and they reaffirmed it, and that is the importance of maintaining the legislative filibuster, the 60-vote threshold for legislation. I'm sorry we went down the path of changing the rules for judges, and then for Supreme Court, and now potentially for legislation. 60 votes is a good thing. 60 votes allows, people say they want us to work together. 60 votes requires us to do that. In the absence of 60-vote rule, everything becomes political. In the absence of 60-vote rule, there's no certainty. A party in power, one that's the majority of the Senate or the president, the election changes and there's a new majority, then we changed what we just passed 2 years before. There's nothing good for job creation and economic security. There's nothing good for families in trying to figure out what's next in their life when the law can change every time a different party has the majority in the United States Senate and House, or there's a new president. My view is that what happened yesterday was not by design. As a matter of fact, the vote, among others, was designed to fail in order to pressure Democratic senators into altering the rules of the Senate and render this place a majority-run institution. Democrats have achieved control. The voters gave them control of both the chambers of the Congress and the White House and are convinced that they have a mandate to erode the governing norms of the Senate. By my count, the Senate stands at an evenly divided 50-50, and the majority, by a slight number, is Democratic in the House of Representatives. Surely this is hardly a mandate for a radically progressive agenda, much less changing the threshold for which minority rights are protected and bipartisan cooperation is promoted. Should the legislative filibuster meet its demise at the hands of this Senate because Democrats decide on a majority vote that the rules that have been in place for decades should be changed overnight on a whim? The august United States Senate will be condemned to a partisan spectacle. The idea that everything should be decided by one vote means that everything here becomes political. And the American people become even more partisan. If every vote in the United States Senate, every outcome is determined by one person, then politics becomes the passion of the American people, by necessity. The 60-vote rule is designed to moderate both sides of a question, to bring us together, to pull us to the middle in something that is more acceptable to the American people than anything we might decide if we could decide it on our own, Republican or Democrat. It means that every citizen would have feel the need to lobby us. The normal course of life becomes much more about politics. And while politics is important to the country, and while it's important for the American people to be engaged, they send us here to make decisions, and that 60-vote rule allows us to make decisions that are more acceptable to them so they can spend their lives living their lives, not worrying about what on any given day the United States Senate might pass. I don't think the motivation by the Senate Democrats is what it may seem to some. And the suggestion is that we can't seem to pass any legislation here. I read in the Wall Street Journal an editorial and op-ed piece by Mike Solon and Bill Green this week. And this was a comment that stood out to me. The movement to end the filibuster is less about a Senate that doesn't work than it is to sell a socialist agenda that doesn't sell. The idea that everything is decided on the margin of one means that we become politics. Politics rules in this country. And the freedoms and liberties that American people enjoy every day because they can rely on not radical change, but modest change, upon improvements day by day, not improvements overnight. means that we have a different country. We certainly would have a different Senate. But a consequence of having a different Senate means America is not what it is today. And again, I say this in a way that would, I hope, remind my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I stand ready to work on many issues that we can bring ourselves together. I hope this week, tomorrow, today, that we learn there's an infrastructure agreement, a bipartisan agreement. This isn't a belief that I have the ability to dominate the agenda of the United States Senate or that one party should. It's a reminder that America is better when we work together, and eliminating the 60-vote rule, ending the filibuster, changes America for the worst. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The senator from New York.
I ask unanimous consent that the scheduled vote be proceed immediately.
Is there objection? Without objection. The question is heard on the Boardman nomination.
Ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there sufficient second?
Is there a second for the yeas and nays?
There appears to be sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Arano. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Markowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Resch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Casey, Duckworth, Gillibrand, Graham, Murphy, Smith, Stabenow. Senators voting in the negative: Bozeman, Daines, Inhofe, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Wicker, Young. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Risch, no. Mrs. Hyde Smith, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sass, no. Miss Lummis, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto. Aye. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall. No. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders. Aye. Mr. King. Mr. King. Aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray. Aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed. Aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen. Aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford. No. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin. Aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff. Aye. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville. No. Mr. Moran, no. Ms. Ernst, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Cotton, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Kramer, Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. McConnell, no.
The yeas are 52, the nays are 48. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar 128, Candace Jackson Akawumi of Illinois to be United States Circuit Judge for the 7th Circuit, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Candace Jackson Akawumi of Illinois to be a United States Circuit Judge for the 7th Circuit shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal.
Mr. Weaver is no.
Sylvia Dye.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Blunt. You're a guy. And you're a guy. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. You're an aye. Thank you. Mr. Burr.
I'm late for an event. I will, can I get back to you tomorrow on this?
Let us know.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Okay. And I'm so sorry I haven't gotten to it.
Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney. Thank you. Yeah. Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Collins, Gillibrand, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Leahy, Manchin, Murkowski, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Tester, Warner, Warnock, Warren, and Wyden. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Capito, Cassidy, Cornyn, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Ernst, Fisher, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Johnson, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Romney, Rounds, Rubio, Scott of Florida, Sullivan, Thune, Tuberville, Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Braun, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Kelly, aye. Ms. Stabenow? Mr. King? Mr. King, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Thank Mr. Graham, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Baldwin, aye. Menendez, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Young, no. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Peters, aye.
The yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
The judiciary, Candace Jackson Akawumi of Illinois to be United States Circuit Judge for the 7th Circuit.
the senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my state proudly calls itself the land of steady habits. Some people in Connecticut think that it's kind of a funny thing to be proud of, being resistant to change. But honestly, in the Northeast, in the crucible of America, we know that there's real value to consistency and tradition. A nation as unique as ours, multicultural, democratic, ever expanding in scope and ambition, we probably can't hold together unless there's some agreement between all of our different peoples about the expectations that we have for each other in the conduct of our national business. Without tradition, our nation's defining dynamism, it might break us. So yeah, it's wildly old-fashioned to hold town meetings where every citizen has got to show up on one particular day to make decisions about how you spend money or what rate you pay in taxes. But that way of governing, created in New England some 4 centuries ago, it's still the method of decision-making in many of our towns. It may not be the most efficient means of government, but tradition matters. You know, it helps hold us together as a country. So I know and appreciate the value of consistency. I don't deny it. And so earlier this week, I read with interest an opinion piece penned by one of my friends in the Senate Democratic Caucus making the argument that amongst the most important reasons to preserve the 60-vote threshold in the Senate is to advance the value of consistency and tradition in American politics. Now, I was glad to read it. I'm proud of my colleague because for too long, the punditry and the activists, they've had near exclusive domain over the debate about the wisdom of changing the rules of this body. And so it's been strange, given how much this place means to the 100 of us who serve here, that we've mostly left the dialogue over its future to those that don't work inside this chamber every day. Yes, right now there is a disagreement amongst Senate Democrats and between the majority of Senate Democrats and the majority of Senate Republicans about how the Senate should operate. But there's no merit in hiding this dispute. There's no valor in letting others define the terms or lay out the conflicting arguments, which I readily submit are compelling on both sides. So let's have the debate. Let's have it right here. No more shadow boxing. The stakes, I would argue, are too important. So let me start here. The argument to keep the 60-vote threshold, to guarantee policy consistency, or to uphold Senate tradition is downright dangerous, because this argument essentially prioritizes consistency over democracy. At the very moment when Americans have less faith than ever before that this place has the capacity to implement the will of the people, the 60-vote threshold is a slap in the face of majoritarianism, which is the bedrock principle of American democracy, the idea that the majority of people get to decide the direction of this country, not elites, not oligarchs like in other nations, people, regular people. To say that Americans can have an election, choose leaders of a particular view, and then watch while the rules of democracy deliberately stop the voters' will from being enacted is to thumb our nose at the American electorate at the very moment when they are actively considering whether American democracy has anything left to offer them. And my colleague argues quite powerfully that the requirement to achieve 60 votes to pass legislation in the Senate guards against rapid policy change, giving several examples, including education, environment policy, and voting rules, as areas where danger might lie if one majority imposed a policy in one Congress that would be undone by the next. I want to walk us through this argument. My first approach might be to postpone the harder question of whether or not to value consistency over democracy and to simply accept for a moment the prioritization of consistency and tradition. I do so knowing that our founding fathers also prioritized consistency. In Federalist 9 and 10, Hamilton and Madison discuss what they call the problem of factions. Madison says that a faction is, quote, a number of citizens, whether amounting to a minority or majority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion adverse to the rights of other citizens. Now notice here that Madison doesn't really care whether the faction represents a minority or majority of citizens. He simply defines it by its cause's malevolence. Now, of course, this was and still is tricky business. Rich white men defining for everybody else what cause is righteous and which cause is wicked. But our founding fathers built a system of government to make rapid policy change, even change supported by the majority of voters, very, very hard to implement. Now, how did they do this? Now, I want to lay this out because if you do care about preventing rapid policy shifts, it's important to understand why the 60-vote threshold isn't necessary, is overkill, given all the other barriers our system has to prevent rapid policy shifts. First, our founding fathers established a bicameral legislature as opposed to a unicameral parliamentary system. That meant that no change could be implemented until two different legislative bodies agreed to the exact same text. Second, they layered on top of that bicameral legislative structure a unitary president with the power to veto that legislation. Third, they put in place an unelected body, the Supreme Court, that could invalidate any statutory change that conflicted with the Constitution. Fourth, they put the House and the Senate and the presidency all on overlapping, conflicting election schedules, guaranteeing that it would be 100% impossible for the voters to sweep out all elected officials and replace them with a new slate all at one moment. And fifth, the founders built a few supermajority requirements, but only for selective occasions: treaties, impeachment, constitutional amendments, the stuff that could last forever. The founding fathers did want extra consensus around that. Now, all of that design has lasted. It's still with us today, but there are other parts of the original design intended to protect the value of consistency, to protect against the danger of faction, that have not lasted. The founders also believed that only white men should vote and that citizens shouldn't be trusted to directly select the members of this body. That's all history, because for all of the anti-faction design that we've kept, we've changed just as much. And all of that change has moved in only one direction, towards more majoritarian democracy. Why? Well, because as our grand experiment, the American experiment, matured, we saw proof of concept. The people could be trusted to govern themselves. They could choose leaders that were more able, more honest, more effective than any king or queen, any sultan or emperor. So we extended the franchise universally. We directly elected the Senate. As America expanded, the new states out west, they gobbled up even more democracy. The West decided to not just elect legislators, but judges and prosecutors, dog catchers and insurance commissioners. Majoritarian rule, it became addictive, and our country grew, and it demanded more and more of it. And that brings us to the 60-vote threshold. The 60-vote threshold in a country built on the strength of direct democracy stands out like a sore, rotting thumb. This anti-majoritarian drain clog designed intentionally to stop the majority of Americans from getting what they want from government. Proponents of existing Senate rules say that in the name of bipartisanship or tradition or consistency of policy, we should purposefully frustrate the changing will of the electorate. But why? Why not trust voters? For instance, voters elected a president and a Congress in 2008 that promised to enact a system of universal health care. Now, it just so happened that at that moment, for the first time in 40 years, there were 60 votes for the party of that view in the Senate. And so a universal health care law was passed. But why should it not be up to the voters and not politicians to review the efficacy of a major policy change like that, and if they so choose, elect leaders to rescind or revise it? Now, I don't want the ACA repealed, but I'm deeply uncomfortable that a 60-vote threshold robs from voters that decision. This preference for policy consistency, intentionally blind to the merits of policy over direct democracy, is particularly insidious at this moment in American history. First, because the 60-vote threshold is being used in a very, very different way today than it has at any time prior in our nation's history. Up until the 1970s, cloture votes were almost non-existent in the Senate. Legislative filibusters were used in those days mostly by racist Southern white senators to stop civil rights bills. But in the 70s, that tactic became more widely employed, but it was still used sparingly. Consider this. In 1994, our colleague, Senator Feinstein, forced a vote on one of the most controversial of all proposals that could come before this body, a ban on assault weapons. It received fewer votes than the Manchin-Toomey background check bill did 30 years later. Senator Feinstein's proposal got 52 votes, Manchin-Toomey got 54 votes. But the assault weapons ban became law, while the background checks bill did not. Why? Because in 1994, many important votes, even the assault weapons ban, were allowed to proceed on a majority vote basis. Not so by 2013. Now, I can make the argument that it was Republicans that started this rapid escalation of the use of the 60-vote threshold, but who really cares? Doesn't matter, because today both parties use it, almost without exception, in a way that looks radically different from the way that the tactic was utilized a half-century ago. And so I would argue that if you want to do an overview of the history of the 60-vote threshold, it doesn't tell a story of the value that the Senate places on consistency. No, it's the opposite. Watching the way that the tactic has been used so differently over time, it demonstrates the value the Senate places on change in practice and tradition. Reforming this rule would frankly just pay heed to this reality. The second danger of valuing consistency over democracy at this moment lies in the signal that it sends to an American public that is in, frankly, no mood for the choices of the elites to be continually substituted for their own collective judgment. Right now, Americans are in kind of a revolutionary mood, and for good reason. More Americans today than at any time in recent history see themselves on the precipice of financial and sometimes spiritual ruin. They are done with economic and political elites, jealously protecting the status quo. And the election of Donald Trump, though revealed by time to be a false prophet, was an unmistakable foot stomp by an electorate that is sick and tired of being taken for granted. So why on earth would our message, amidst this growing populist tempest, be to tell voters that rules in the Senate are required to protect them from their own bad judgment, to take from them purposefully the ability to change policies whenever and however they wish? I submit to you that today, right now, the replacement of popular will by anti-majoritarian rule rigging could destroy us. Today, more than ever, voters want to know that their vote counts every election. And continuing to give minorities here in the Senate power to stop change is dangerously disconsonant with the current political mood of this country. Take power away from the American people at your peril. Finally, on this question of the value we should place on consistency, I want to raise the problem of the city firehouse. Now, firehouses are places that value consistency and tradition. Firefighters spend a lot of time in close quarters together. When that alarm rings, they're required to work together in precise, disciplined unison to get out the door in seconds in order to save lives and property. Practices change in a firehouse, but carefully and through consensus decision-making. Keeping everybody together matters when the stakes are so high. But what were to happen if inside that firehouse, a sizable group of firefighters decided one day that the mission of the department should no longer be to put out fires, but maybe instead to just let them burn a little? Wouldn't then the value of consensus decision-making become a little less important? If you were a homeowner, wouldn't you want to make sure that the firefighters who still wanted to fight fires were setting the rules and not the guys who were okay with the houses in the neighborhood burning down? Now, I know this is a crude analogy, but to value consistency or tradition above everything else, I think you have to be pretty certain that everybody in your club, everybody on your team, is guided by the same foundational goal. In the case of the United States Senate, our goal, our end game, has always been simple: the preservation of American democracy, the belief that every American should have a say in who governs and the persons that they choose, and no one else should be seated in power. Now, we've had fights, often vicious in nature, over the course of our nation's history over how fast we should expand the vote, how quickly we should reform our Constitution to allow for more direct democracy. But never before has one party actively advocated for the lessening of democracy. Never before has one party openly advocated for candidates who received the smaller share of the vote to be made president of the United States. In the last year, a Democratic Rubicon has been crossed by one party, and we can't ignore this devastating blow to our nation. You cannot value consistency in practice when a large faction of your group's members don't believe in the underlying mission of your organization any longer. The firehouse can't just keep doing the same things it always does year after year for the sake of consistency or tradition or consensus when 2 or 3 of your members that hop on the fire truck when that alarm sounds aren't intending to actually put out the fire when they arrive at the building. Giving Republicans a veto power over legislation when they no longer believe in the same way the Democrats do or Republicans used to in the sacredness of the vote is to risk the voluntary destruction of our democracy. Consistency as a value has merit. It does. But in this business, consistency is often put on an unhealthy pedestal. What's the value of being consistent when all the circumstances around you are changing? Where's the strength in sticking to your position when everything around you is in metamorphosis? When democracy itself is being attacked in a brutal, coordinated, and unprecedented volley of blows, what is the good of holding to a position just for the sake of being consistent if the primary consequence is to simply greenlight the assault to continue? Consistency and tradition and bipartisanship, they matter, but not at the expense of democracy. Not at a moment when millions of voters are questioning the wisdom of American democracy because no matter who they elect, nothing seems to change. And not when one party has increasingly abandoned the joint project to which all members of this body swore an oath as a condition of our membership. I yield the floor. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Senator, Mr. President, I know Senator Marshall is ready to speak, and I apologize for delaying him with my rather long remarks, but I would first ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I would also ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 10 a.m. Thursday, June 24th, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed, that upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to the consideration of S-1251, the Growing Climate Solutions Act, under the previous order. Further, that all time on the bill expire at 11 a.m., that there be 2 minutes for debate equally divided prior to each vote, with all provisions of the order remaining in effect, that upon disposition of S-1251, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Jackson Aquawumi nomination, with all post-cloture time expiring at 1:45 p.m. Finally, that if the nomination is confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. For the information of senators, there will be 2 roll call votes starting at 11 a.m. and 1 vote at 1:45 p.m. And if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of Senator Marshall and Senator Brown.
Without objection.
Mr. President,
The senator from Kansas.
I ask unanimous consent to use 2 scientific models as props during my speech.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it seems like every week we get a new update on the timeline for the origin of the COVID-19 virus. This week we learned that in October 2019, that over 1,000 soldiers from over 100 countries had gathered in Wuhan, China for a military Olympics, if you will. And then what we learned is several weeks after that event that many of our own athletes, our own military personnel became ill, as well as folks from other countries. And we went back further and we talked to some of those soldiers, and they told us that Wuhan, China looked like a ghost town during that event. A town of over 11 million people looked like a ghost town. And what I'm frustrated about, Mr. President, is that the CDC's not investigated this, the military's not investigated it, that during the proper times we could have tested their antibodies. When we learned of this, maybe perhaps in March or April, they probably still had antibodies. But even today, we could investigate it. But we need the FDA to do their job as well. We need the FDA to pass a T-cell test so we could go back and see if these soldiers who became ill after this event, to see if indeed this was the COVID-19 virus. Certainly the timeline, by all accounts, is going backwards every month. But I think it's time to update the American public, too, on what I feel are the lab origins of this virus. And certainly this is just a theory. But I think we need to look into and discover and talk more about the biological origin of this virus. Mr. President, this is a model of COVID-19, the virus that's killed millions of people across the world. It looks very much like the original SARS virus, with a few exceptions. And that exception is a protein spike. The protein spike that I'm talking about is composed of 2 units, and we'll call those 2 units S1 and S2, and this is a model of that COVID-19 protein spike. It is very special, it's very unique. The S1 spike, let's talk about that just for a second. The S1 spike looks very similar, looks exactly like viral gain-of-function research that was conducted between a lab in North Carolina and with Dr. Shi, the bat lady from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That S1 spike sticks to lung cells like glue. So what we did, again, this is NIH-funded research, North Carolina lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. What we did is we took the original SARS virus and we slapped a protein spike on it that made it stick to human cells like glue. Think of it like a key in a lock. Think about that if you have a human cell is the lock, that there needed to be a special key. So they invented a special key that would impact and go into only human cells. And then, so that was done about 2015. But then after that, things go dark. We don't know what happened, but somehow this COVID-19 virus has another part of this protein spike, and we'll call it the S2 unit. The theory is that in the Wuhan Institute of Virology and possibly in the Wuhan CDC lab, further research was done, and they developed a special part of this spike, the S2 unit, and this is what's so special about it. It has what we call a furin cleavage site. The furin cleavage site is, don't take it from me, take it from Nobel laureate Dr. David Baltimore. Dr. Baltimore said the furin cleavage site, and I'm paraphrasing here, with its double arginine codons, this is the smoking gun for the lab origin of the virus. That double arginine codon just doesn't occur in nature. And that only human cells have the ability to use that furin cleavage spike and break this into two separate units, and that's what allows this virus to dump its genetic material into human lung cells and replicate. As a physician, a person that studied virology a bit, this protein spike just doesn't look like it comes from nature. Everything about it would suggest that it was made in a laboratory. It's just too mean, it's too angry, it's just too perfect, it's too infectious. And the unique thing about it is, though some would make us believe that this virus comes from bats, this virus doesn't like bats. It only took American scientists and the Chinese scientists 4 months to discover the origin of the original SARS virus, that it came from a bat and then it went to another animal, an intermediate host. It only took us 4 months to discover that virus. On the MERS virus, on the other hand, it took us about 9 months. Here we are 18 months later, and we don't have any type of an intermediate host. All the mapping that we're seeing points that this virus was made in a laboratory. Now, the Wuhan lab could disprove me. They have the data to prove me wrong, but I'm afraid that data is now gone. It's gone forever, most likely destroyed, unless, of course, we can find it in a cloud somewhere. It's outrageous that a comprehensive investigation on the origins of COVID-19 has still not been carried out. Now, I'm proud that this body passed a resolution that Senator Gillibrand and I put together calling for a transparent investigation of the COVID-19 outbreak mandated by the World Health Assembly, unanimously passed this body. And that resolution demanded a full and transparent investigation to include the United States and our allies and our partners around the world. But now it's time for the Senate to do our job. It's time for the Senate to fully investigate the origins of this virus as well. It would be utterly irresponsible to suffer through the worst pandemic in a century and not have the origins fully investigated. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Did you read this, Mr. President? Yeah. Mr. President, I have 8 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and the minority leaders.
Duly noted.
I yield the floor.
President,
The senator from Ohio.
are we in a quorum?
We are not.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. Last week, America lost a baseball legend, a pioneer in civil rights, Jim Mudcat Grant. He joined the Cleveland Indians in 1958. He spent 14 years in the major leagues. I remember watching him play when I was a kid growing up in Cleveland in the 1960s. Cleveland has been, more than any other franchise perhaps, a pioneer for change in baseball. Cleveland had the first black player in the American League, Larry Doby, Hall of Famer. Came in the league only about 2 months after Jackie Robinson integrated the National League. Cleveland had the first black manager, Hall of Famer Frank Robinson. And Cleveland had Mudcat Grant, who refused to be silent in the face of segregated hotels and racist slurs and discrimination from management. Grant was an accomplished singer with a beautiful voice. He organized the singing group Mudcat and the Kittens to make up the income he was denied that other players had, white players had, in advertising and endorsements. Companies wouldn't hire a black player. They toured the country during the off-season, performing on Johnny Carson and in places a little less known. I remember Grant in later years serving as an announcer for Cleveland Indians games with a Southern drawl that was unmistakable. He didn't just use that voice, though, for entertainment or commentating on plays. He used it to speak out for civil rights. During the national anthem at one game, predating Colin Kaepernick, Mudcat Grant, in the 1960s, before civil rights and voting rights had passed this Congress, he said during the national anthem, he said, "This land is not free. I can't even go to Mississippi and sit down at a lunch counter." A Major League Baseball player. In 1958, he and his white teammate Gary Bell roomed together for away games, becoming the first time players in those days, when they were paid less in management, charged less, whatever, players roomed together. Two players would room together. Gary Bell and Mudcat Grant were the first black and white roommates in the major leagues in 1958. While running for president, Senator John F. Kennedy invited Mudcat Grant to breakfast. Grant didn't hold back. He talked openly with Senator Kennedy, with the future president, about the poverty he grew up in, the racism he endured every day. This was 1960, as a Major League Baseball player. Of course, it wasn't only his activism we remember Mudcat Grant for. We know his talent on the field. He was minor league's Rookie of the Year in 1954, only 7 years after baseball was integrated. In 1965, he was the first black player to win 20 games in the American League. He shouldn't have been the first, but listen to this. For years, major league managers conspired to prevent black pitchers from becoming 20-game winners. That almost doesn't make sense. Well, Grant said some catchers would tell the hitters, the opposing hitters, while they were catching, what was coming because they didn't want you to do well as a pitcher. Other managers, when a pitcher was getting close to 20 games, other managers sat the player down so he couldn't win 20 games as a black man. After black players pass away, we often hear about how they were among the underappreciated talents of the game. That's not a coincidence. In addition to being a singer, Grant was also a writer. He published a book in 2007 called The Black Aces. It's about the great African-American pitchers, part of his project to tell more stories about black players and to teach more people about the history of baseball integration. It's the kind of stories we need to tell more often. Our country is richer, as the presiding officer representing Arizona knows. The